Imagine spending years building a life with someone you love. You meet, fall in love, get married, buy a home, and begin creating memories you expect will last a lifetime. You stand beside each other through ordinary days and extraordinary hardships, believing that no matter what life brings, you'll face it together. Now imagine that one evening, you walk through your own front door expecting nothing more than another quiet night. Instead, you discover your spouse brutally murdered. Within hours, police begin asking questions. Within days, those questions become accusations. The people who once comforted you begin looking at you with suspicion. News reports describe you as the obvious suspect. Detectives believe they've solved the case before all the evidence has even been examined. To the outside world, it appears simple. A husband, a wife, a murder. But some cases only appear straightforward because the truth is hiding in plain sight. Sometimes the person everyone suspects isn't the one investigators should be watching. Sometimes the most dangerous individual isn't angry, violent, or intimidating. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they comfort grieving families. Sometimes they attend funerals. And sometimes they quietly position themselves to benefit from another person's death. As investigators would later discover, this wasn't simply a story about a marriage ending in tragedy. It was a story involving friendship, money, trust, and an insurance policy that would eventually expose one of the most controversial criminal investigations in modern American history. For years, one question remained unanswered. Who really killed Elizabeth Betsy Faria? The story begins in Lincoln County, Missouri, a largely rural area located northwest of St. Louis. Life there moved at a slower pace than in nearby cities. Neighbors recognized each other's vehicles. Families attended the same churches for years. People shopped at the same grocery stores, celebrated community events together, and often trusted one another without hesitation. It was the kind of place where friendships could last decades. It was also the kind of place where betrayal could remain hidden behind familiar faces. Long before investigators, courtrooms, and national headlines became part of this story, three ordinary people were living lives that seemed completely unrelated. One was a woman known for her kindness despite facing serious health problems. Another was the husband who believed his greatest responsibility was caring for the woman he loved. Another married couple trying to navigate adulthood together. Unfortunately, life had other plans. In time, Betsy received devastating medical news. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer. The diagnosis changed everything. Treatments became part of everyday life. Hospital visits replaced ordinary routines. Medical appointments filled calendars. Physical exhaustion became constant. Cancer doesn't only affect the patient. It affects spouses, children, friends, entire families. Russ remained involved throughout her treatment, helping care for her as the disease progressed. Those closest to the family watched as Betsy continued fighting, refusing to let the illness define her. During that difficult period, another person became increasingly involved in Betsy's life, a woman who appeared to be one of her closest friends. Her name was Pam Hupp. At first, there seemed to be nothing unusual about their friendship. Pam often drove Betsy to medical appointments. She spent time with her. She offered emotional support. She presented herself as someone willing to help during the hardest period of Betsy's life. To many people, Pam appeared compassionate, dependable, exactly the kind of friend anyone would hope to have during a serious illness. No one could have imagined that, years later, investigators would begin asking whether that friendship had concealed something far more sinister. Because sometimes, the people standing closest to us know exactly what we have, exactly what we're afraid of, and exactly what we stand to lose. People described him as outspoken and humorous. He wasn't perfect. Few people are, but those closest to him generally saw someone loyal to his family and committed to the people he cared about. When Russ met Betsy, their relationship developed naturally. They shared similar values. Both appreciated ordinary moments more than extravagant lifestyles. Neither expected fame nor extraordinary wealth. They simply wanted a peaceful life together. As their relationship grew stronger, marriage seemed like the obvious next step. Friends remembered seeing a couple who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Like every marriage, theirs had disagreements. There were stressful days, financial concerns, health worries, normal challenges faced by countless American couples. But there was little to suggest that their relationship would one day become the focus of one of Missouri's most controversial murder cases. By 2011, Betsy Faria's life had been reshaped by cancer. What had once been a private medical struggle now affected nearly every part of her day. The treatments left her exhausted, and even ordinary tasks could become overwhelming. Some days she had enough strength to spend time with family and friends. On others, simply getting out of bed took everything she had. Cancer affects more than the body. It changes routines. It changes relationships. And for families like the Farias, it forces conversations no one ever wants to have. Russ Faria stayed beside his wife through those difficult months. Friends later described him as hopeful, even as Betsy's condition became more serious. Hospital visits became routine. Doctors monitored her closely. Family members waited for better news. But every appointment carried the same uncertainty. During that same period, one familiar person became increasingly present in Betsy's life. Pam Hupp. Pam was not a stranger. Betsy trusted her. She helped when help was needed most. She often drove Betsy to doctor's appointments and spent time with her while Russ was working. To friends and family, Pam seemed like exactly the kind of person anyone would want nearby during a medical crisis. Reliable, supportive, compassionate. Years later, investigators would look back at those same acts of kindness very differently. As Betsy's illness progressed, she leaned more heavily on the people closest to her. Family helped where they could. Friends checked in regularly. But Pam Hupp appeared especially devoted. She was not just someone who visited from time to time. She had become part of Betsy's daily support system. For someone facing a life-threatening illness, that kind of help can feel invaluable. When cancer begins to dominate everyday life, practical support matters just as much as emotional comfort. Rides to appointments, picking up prescriptions, running errands, keeping someone company through long days. Pam seemed willing to do all of it. At the time, nothing about that appeared suspicious. In fact, many people later said they admired how much she seemed to care. No one imagined that this friendship would eventually become one of the most closely examined relationships in Missouri criminal history. The insurance decision. As Betsy's health continued to decline, she was forced to think about something few people want to face. What happens to the people you love if you do not survive? Like many Americans dealing with serious illness, Betsy had a life insurance policy intended to provide financial security for her family, but according to later court testimony and investigative records, that policy changed just days before her death. Instead of naming her husband, Betsy designated Pam Hupp as the beneficiary of approximately $150,000. That decision would later become one of the most disputed parts of the entire case. Pam would later say Betsy wanted her to distribute the money to Betsy's daughters. Investigators, however, questioned that explanation. No written trust agreement was ever produced. No legal document instructed Pam to divide the money among the family, and after Betsy's death, the insurance proceeds were not handled in the way many people expected. Years later, prosecutors would argue that the policy became a crucial piece of the investigation. But in those final days, almost no one outside Betsy and Pam understood the significance of that change. At the time, it seemed like a private matter between close friends. Only later would investigators begin asking whether that decision had changed everything. December 2011. Christmas was only weeks away, and families across Missouri were preparing for the holidays. Inside the Faria household, though, life looked very different. The season was overshadowed by hospital visits, medications, and uncertainty. Despite everything she was facing, Betsy kept trying to maintain as much normalcy as possible. Friends visited. Family checked in. Pam remained a regular presence. No one could have known they were witnessing Betsy's final days. On December 27, 2011, Betsy attended another chemotherapy appointment. The treatment left her physically drained. Because she was not feeling well enough to drive herself, Pam Hupp offered to take her home. Witnesses later confirmed that Pam drove Betsy from the treatment center back toward her residence. That ride would later become one of the most discussed moments in the investigation. It was among the last confirmed times Betsy was seen alive. After arriving home, Betsy settled in for what should have been a quiet evening. Russ, meanwhile, was away spending time with friends, a fact investigators would later examine as they reconstructed everyone's movements that night. At the time, None of it seemed unusual. It was simply another evening, or so it appeared. The night everything changed. As darkness settled over Lincoln County, the Faria home became eerily quiet. Hours passed. No one outside the house knew that history was about to change. Later that evening, Russ Faria returned home. What he found inside would become one of the most disturbing moments of his life. Betsy was dead. She had suffered a brutal and violent attack. The crime scene shocked even experienced investigators. Emergency responders arrived quickly. Detectives secured the home. Neighbors watched from a distance as flashing police lights illuminated the quiet neighborhood. Within hours, investigators began documenting every detail, every fingerprint, every drop of blood, every possible clue. But even in those earliest hours, attention began turning towards someone investigators believed had both opportunity and motive. Russ Faria. Before all the evidence had been fully analyzed, before every lead had been explored, suspicion had already begun to settle on the grieving husband, and that early assumption would shape nearly everything that followed. While detectives processed the crime scene, one critical question remained unanswered. Who had killed Betsy Faria? Investigators believed they already knew, but as the years passed, evidence would emerge suggesting the truth was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The hours following Betsy's death moved quickly. Detectives interviewed everyone who had been in contact with her during the final days of her life. Family members, friends, medical staff, and anyone who might help establish a timeline were questioned. Russ was interviewed extensively. He described his evening, explained where he had been, and answered investigators' questions. According to investigators, several aspects of his behavior immediately raised concerns. One was his initial belief during the 911 call that Betsy might have taken her own life before he realized the extent of her injuries. Another was the emotional state he displayed while officers were at the scene. Investigators also noted blood-stained slippers found in a closet and later cited the results of a polygraph examination. Although polygraph results are generally not admissible as evidence in court, Wikipedia. As detectives continued interviewing witnesses, Pam Hupp also met with investigators. She explained that she had driven Betsy home after chemotherapy and claimed she left shortly after dropping her off. She also began sharing information about Russ and Betsy's marriage. Pam told investigators that Betsy had expressed fear of her husband and had spoken about problems within the marriage. Those statements would later become an important part of the prosecution's theory, Wikipedia. Investigators searched Betsy's computer. Among the files they found was a document that appeared to describe concerns Betsy supposedly had about Russ. At the time, detectives considered it significant. Years later, however, the document itself would become highly controversial during later proceedings. Questions were raised about when it had been created and whether it could reliably be attributed to Betsy, Wikipedia. Meanwhile, Russ's friends continued telling investigators the same story. They said Russ had spent the evening with them during their regular Tuesday game night. Phone records, receipts, and surveillance footage would later become part of the discussion about his whereabouts that evening. His defense would argue that these records supported his alibi, St. Louis magazine. Despite those accounts, investigators believed they had enough evidence to move forward. On January 4, 2012, only days after Betsy's funeral, Russ Faria was formally charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. Unable to post bail, he was taken into custody, Wikipedia. The arrest stunned those closest to him. Some believed detectives had acted quickly because, statistically, spouses are often investigated first in domestic homicides. Others believed investigators had correctly identified the killer. Outside the courthouse, public opinion quickly hardened. Many people assumed the case had already been solved. Television reports described the husband as the accused killer. Few outside the investigation paid much attention to the woman who had been the last confirmed person to see Betsy alive. Pam Hupp remained free. She continued speaking with investigators and would eventually become one of the prosecution's most important witnesses against Russ. As Russ waited in jail, his attorney, Joel Schwartz, began reviewing thousands of pages of investigative reports. The more he studied the evidence, the more convinced he became that detectives had overlooked critical questions. Why had Betsy changed her life insurance beneficiary just days before her death? Why hadn't investigators focused more closely on the person who stood to receive that money? And why had the last person known to have seen Betsy alive received so little scrutiny compared with the man sitting behind bars? Those questions would soon become central to the defense. But first, prosecutors prepared to present what they believed was a straightforward murder case, a husband, a violent crime, and a jury they hoped would see no reasonable doubt. Fall of 2013. Nearly 2 years had passed since Betsy Faria's murder. The case had drawn widespread attention across Missouri. Reporters filled the courtroom. Local residents followed every development, eager to hear the evidence for themselves. For prosecutors, the theory was straightforward. They argued that Russ Faria had killed his wife inside their home after returning from game night. They pointed to the violent nature of the attack, statements they claimed reflected problems within the marriage, and circumstantial evidence they believed supported their case. The defense saw the investigation very differently. Attorney Joel Schwartz told the jury that detectives had reached a conclusion too early and then built the investigation around it. According to the defense, investigators failed to fully pursue other leads once they focused on Russ. Throughout the trial, jurors heard testimony from detectives, forensic specialists, friends, and family members. The prosecution presented evidence it believed linked Russ to the crime scene. The defense responded by emphasizing his alibi. Several friends testified that Russ had spent the evening with them during their regular game night. Phone records and other evidence were introduced to support the timeline that placed him away from the house during much of the evening. One issue quickly became a major point of disagreement. The defense wanted to question witnesses about Pam Hupp and Betsy's life insurance policy. Their argument was simple. If another person had both opportunity and a possible financial motive, the jury should be allowed to hear that evidence. However, the trial judge placed limits on what the defense could present regarding Pam Hupp. As a result, the jury heard far less about her role than the defense had hoped. That decision would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the trial. Pam Hupp eventually took the witness stand. She testified that Betsy had been afraid of Russ and described conversations she claimed to have had with her friend before the murder. Her testimony supported the prosecution's theory that the marriage had become troubled. Defense attorneys challenged her credibility during cross-examination, but without being able to fully explore alternative theories before the jury, their options were limited. As the days passed, they argued that unanswered questions remained and that investigators had failed to follow every lead. The jury began deliberating. Hours turned into a full day. Family members from both sides waited anxiously inside the courthouse. Finally, the jurors returned. The courtroom fell silent. The foreperson stood. Russ Faria was found guilty of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. The verdict shocked many of his supporters. Russ was later sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder conviction, along with an additional sentence on the armed criminal action charge. For prosecutors, justice had been served. The case appeared closed. Betsy Faria's killer, they believed, had been convicted. But outside the courtroom, not everyone agreed. Some investigators, legal observers, and journalists continued asking difficult questions. The life insurance policy still lingered in the background. So did the woman who received its proceeds. While Russ entered prison, Pam Hupp returned to her everyday life. To many people, she was simply a grieving friend who had testified in court. But over time, new information would begin to emerge. Information that would force investigators to re-examine assumptions they once believed were beyond question. And when those questions finally resurfaced, they would shake the case to its core. For Russ Faria, the guilty verdict was more than a prison sentence. It meant spending the rest of his life behind bars for a crime he insisted he did not commit. As the prison doors closed behind him, many believed the case was over. But outside those walls, his attorneys refused to give up. Joel Schwartz and the defense team returned to the evidence not to prove who killed Betsy, but to determine whether Russ had truly received a fair trial. The deeper they looked, the more questions they found. Why had investigators focused almost exclusively on Russ from the beginning? Why had so little attention been paid to the woman who had driven Betsy home from chemotherapy only hours before she was killed? And perhaps the most troubling question of all, why hadn't the jury heard the full story about the $150,000 life insurance policy? The defense appealed the conviction, arguing that jurors had been prevented from hearing evidence that could have pointed to another possible suspect. In 2015, the Missouri Court of Appeals agreed that significant errors had occurred during the first trial. The court ruled that evidence concerning Pam Hupp should have been presented to the jury because it could have affected the outcome of the case. Russ Faria's conviction was overturned. After spending years in prison for a crime he maintained he never committed, he was granted a new trial. The news stunned Missouri. A case many believed had been solved was suddenly reopened. For prosecutors, it was a major setback. For Russ, it was the first real sign that justice might still be possible. When the second trial began in late 2015, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt completely different. This time, the defense was allowed to present a broader picture of the investigation. Jurors heard about Pam Hupp's role in Betsy's life. They learned that Betsy had changed the beneficiary of her life insurance policy shortly before her death, naming Pam, not Russ. They heard testimony regarding Pam's statements to investigators and the financial benefit she received after Betsy's death. The defense argued that investigators had become so convinced Russ was guilty that they failed to fully investigate other leads. They reminded jurors that the burden of proof rested entirely with the prosecution. After hearing all of the evidence, the jury reached a very different conclusion from the first. Russ Faria was found not guilty. After years behind bars, he walked out of the courtroom a free man. His family embraced him. Supporters celebrated. But amid the relief, one painful reality remained. Betsy Faria had still been murdered. If Russ had not committed the crime, then who had? That question forced investigators to revisit evidence they had once considered settled. Attention gradually shifted towards someone whose name had appeared throughout the investigation from the very beginning. Pam Hupp. As detectives re-examined the case, they noticed inconsistencies in her statements. They looked again at the insurance money. They reviewed timelines, witness interviews, phone records, financial information. One by one, details that had once seemed insignificant began taking on new meaning. Yet before investigators could fully build a murder case against Pam, another shocking crime would change everything. On August 16, 2016, emergency calls reported a violent confrontation at Pam Hupp's home. Responding officers found a man suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. His name was Louis Gumpenberger. Before dying, he managed to tell officers that he had been kidnapped. Pam offered detectives an extraordinary explanation. She claimed Gumpenberger had entered her home as part of a plan to murder her. According to her account, she had acted in self-defense. Investigators immediately began examining the evidence. But as they reconstructed the events, serious problems emerged. Security footage, witness accounts, cell phone data, and the victim's background painted a picture that differed sharply from Pam's version of events. Detectives soon alleged that Gumpenberger had been lured to Pam's house under false pretenses. Rather than being part of a kidnapping plot, investigators believed he had been an innocent man targeted in a carefully planned scheme. Authorities later alleged that the purpose of the plot was to create a fake attack that would shift suspicion away from Pam in the Faria investigation. The case shocked Missouri. It also transformed the Betsy Faria investigation. For the first time, law enforcement publicly viewed Pam Hupp not simply as an important witness, but as a potential suspect capable of planning elaborate crimes. The narrative surrounding the case changed almost overnight. Everything investigators believed they knew was suddenly open to question, and with renewed attention focused squarely on Pam Hupp, prosecutors prepared for the most significant development in the case since Betsy's murder, a murder charge that many believed should have come years earlier. The investigation into Louis Gumpenberger's death changed everything. As detectives examined the evidence surrounding the shooting, they concluded that the incident was far more complex than a simple act of self-defense. The investigation uncovered new leads, prompted fresh interviews, and caused authorities to revisit the evidence from Betsy Faria's murder with renewed urgency. For nearly a decade, questions had lingered. Why had Betsy changed her life insurance beneficiary just days before her death? Why had the investigation focused so heavily on Russ Faria while other leads received less attention? And why had someone who stood to receive a substantial financial benefit never faced the same level of scrutiny during the original investigation? As investigators reassembled the timeline, those questions became impossible to ignore. In July 2021, prosecutors announced that Pam Hupp had been charged with the murder of Betsy Faria. For Betsy's family, the announcement brought a mixture of relief and heartbreak. Relief that the investigation was moving forward. Heartbreak because it came almost 10 years after Betsy's death. For Russ Faria, the news was deeply emotional. He had spent years fighting to clear his name after being wrongfully convicted. Although he had regained his freedom, nothing could return the years he had lost or erase the pain of being accused of murdering the woman he loved. As prosecutors prepared their case, they argued that the life insurance policy had provided a financial motive, and that the evidence, viewed as a whole, pointed toward Pam Hupp's involvement. Before the case reached a full murder trial, another major legal development occurred. In 2022, Pam Hupp pleaded guilty to the murder of Louis Gumpenberger and received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Then, in 2023, she entered an Alford plea in the Betsy Faria murder case. By doing so, she accepted a life sentence while acknowledging that the prosecution had enough evidence that a jury could likely convict her, even though she did not formally admit guilt. With that plea, one of Missouri's most controversial criminal cases finally reached its legal conclusion. But legal closure is not the same as healing. Betsy Faria's family still had to live with the loss of a mother, daughter, and friend. A life interrupted by years of wrongful imprisonment. The investigators, attorneys, and judges involved in the case were left with difficult questions about how the original investigation had unfolded and what lessons could be learned from it. Today, the Betsy Faria case is studied not only because of its shocking twists, but also because it highlights two important realities of the justice system. The first is that investigators must remain willing to follow evidence wherever it leads, even if it challenges their initial assumptions. The second is that every person accused of a crime deserves a fair trial in which all relevant, admissible evidence can be properly considered. When those principles are tested, the consequences can affect innocent people, victims' families, and public confidence in the justice system itself. Betsy Faria never had the chance to tell her own story. What remains are the facts uncovered through years of investigation, appeals, and court proceedings. Her case serves as a reminder that justice can sometimes take years to achieve, and that finding the truth often requires investigators to question their earliest conclusions. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime documentaries based on verified facts. Our goal is to tell these stories with accuracy, respect, and compassion for the victims and everyone affected. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember that in every investigation, the smallest overlooked detail can sometimes change everything.